Yeah, going back to the Virginia plan that you mentioned earlier, this was really the first sort of comprehensive plan that set the tone for the convention. And it was more of a proponent for strong national government. It had more so the support of, larger states. There sort of was two coalitions forming between large states and small states, obviously, because, they would have different agendas and different views of how different interests of how they would want, the government to look. And the main problem that bogged down the convention was representation, because the small states wanted equal representation, larger states wanted a more proportional representation. But what was the Virginia plan? What exactly did it propose?
It was some, dozen or more resolutions that were rather broadly stated that would create a bicameral legislature and an executive branch and uh, address some of the pressing issues for how you would structure the government. And were largely open ended. So, they understood that these would have to command uh, support from different places, different delegates from different places. Uh, they weren't terribly detailed. And that was the first process they went through, was debating each of those resolutions, amending them, and then giving that to the first significant committee, the Committee of Detail, to try to create a draft. Uh, it was not an easy process. You point out representation was the real stumbling block, and somewhat incoherently. The small states were quite paranoid that they would be swamped by the big states uh, in terms of power. And Madison, who was a very rationalist person, he didn't he wasn't great with emotions, but he was great with reason. Um, he uh, he couldn't figure this out, and he kept saying, in the history of this country, which is only what 12 years, the large states and the small states have never had a disagreement. The North and the South, yeah, they argue. Commercial classes versus planters, they argue, but it's never been large states against small states. And frankly, since then, it never has been. Uh, so it was simply something they felt emotionally. They were giving up some of their rights as a state. And, one guy actually just said it. I think that one of the Delaware delegates, he said, frankly, gentlemen, we do not trust you. Uh, and, you know, you, you have to address that. You have to deal with it. And that's how we ended up with the Senate, uh, which gives equal representation to each state. It's pretty anti-democratic as a structure, but I'm sure it will never be changed because there's a lot of small states who love having their equal representation.
Yeah, it truly is one of the great compromises in history. I mean, it was probably extremely difficult to reach, and you make the case that it was an emotional argument from the small states that they didn't want to give up their rights. But I do think that it is truly one of the greatest compromises in history. I actually had the privilege of touring the US Capitol building like probably 3 weeks ago, maybe a month now. And before you tour the Capitol building, they show a short little documentary that's maybe 15, 20 minutes long, kind of going through the compromise of the Senate and the House and how the country was founded. And it truly is, it's masterful. But this sort of gets rebutted after the small states are sort of caught off guard and realize that the larger states are sort of controlling the convention thus far, and they propose their rebuttal, which is the New Jersey plan. So, can you walk me through the New Jersey plan?
Yeah, I mean, it simply preserved a great many powers for the states. and that was the idea. And it would not have been a very significant departure from the Articles of Confederation. So uh, it was a real uh, stalemate between those two groups. There was in my analysis, there was an attempt to break that stalemate uh, with a sort of grimy compromise between the slave states of the South, South Carolina, uh, Virginia, Maryland, and uh, what were the past for the large states, which was then Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and Massachusetts, excuse me. Uh, and Georgia was one of the small states too. And that alliance held a narrow uh, majority for a couple of weeks, and then it's one of the great puzzles of the convention. It fell apart, and we're not sure why. I spent a crazy amount of time trying to figure it out, and I've got a few hypotheses I won't inflict on you, but it is uh, it remains a somewhat mysterious action development, and it seems to me Washington was in on it too on that resolution. There was a key procedural vote, which really he didn't have to rule the way he did, and the way he ruled gave the small states the wedge they needed to preserve uh, uh, state by state representation in one house. And I think that was his choice.
No, I would love to hear your hypothesis on the matter.
Well, I think that uh, the people who had made the original deal, large states and small states, were very aggressive types. Rutledge of South Carolina and Wilson of Pennsylvania, and they were not interested in compromising on this. And I think you can see the hand of others. John Dickinson, he was a Delaware delegate, although also a Pennsylvanian, uh, and ultimately Ben Franklin, uh, supporting the idea that we got to do something here, or else we're just going to blow this thing up. The actual voting focuses on two delegations nobody looks at. One was the Georgia delegation, which their delegates took a walkabout um, and canceled themselves out, and also the Maryland delegation, which, as a Marylander, I am somewhat offended by this, but it was a profoundly mediocre group of people. uh, and they, again, uh, they changed their vote, and it was changed by having certain people absent, which was a way to uh, you didn't force them to physically change their vote, but the state's vote changed. So that maneuvering hung up what the previous alliance was doing, and it just solidified the stalemate. Washington allowed that to happen, uh, and that meant the large state, small state, slave state alliance had to come to the table, and so they gave in on the Senate.